Hello, I'm Mark Hemingway. I'm a senior writer at Real Clear Investigations in Washington, D.C. And a few years ago, I had the privilege of being a visiting Pulliam Fellow in Journalism at Hillsdale College. So I am very familiar with the institution and pleased to be here today. To start, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I know there are lots of friends in the Hillsdale community that I'd love to catch up with in person, but we'll have to resume the pleasantries at some point in the future. Speaking for myself, I hope that comes at a time when I've been able to visit a barber with more regularity than I have been in recent weeks. I prepared some remarks today dealing with our public health agencies and our lack of preparedness to fight the coronavirus pandemic. There's a lot to be said about this topic, but first I think something needs to be said, and that is this. So far, there's not a lot of evidence that the US was especially ill-prepared for the coronavirus. There have been a number of mistakes, and had a better course of action been settled on at an earlier date, it's very possible that a great many of the 40,000 Americans who have died of coronavirus to date might have been saved. We need to take stock of those mistakes, and I plan on doing some of that today. However, the dominant media narrative here in the US would have you believe that the United States was grossly unprepared, and as a result, the disease has ravaged the United States in a uniquely disastrous way. Earlier this week, The Atlantic published an essay by National Book Award winner George Packer, headlined, "We are living in a failed state. The coronavirus didn't break America, it revealed what was already broken." I certainly think our handling of the pandemic continues to necessitate caution, but it's worth pointing out that once you discard the misleading top-line numbers the media like to dwell on, Belgium, France, Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and everyone's favorite socialist paradise, Sweden, have all had more per capita deaths as a result of the coronavirus than the United States. And if you account for the fact that nearly half of the deaths in the US have occurred in a few square miles in New York City, where the disease was aided by unusual population density, as well as the clearly disastrous decision by local authorities to keep the subways running, the US death toll would be very significantly lower. Despite performing worse than the US on perhaps the key coronavirus metric, would anyone in their right mind think of Sweden and Switzerland and having been exposed as failed states? The US has also far outperformed the doomsday metrics regularly churned out by scientists in the last month or so. Others more informed than I will have more to say about the problem of statistical modeling, but it's worth remembering the line from famous statistician George Box. "All models are wrong, but some are useful." Clearly at this point, we have no clear idea what models are useful in this instance, but that hasn't stopped people from seizing on models, which in some cases are already demonstrably wrong, to push their preferred narrative that the US was singularly unprepared. Indeed, the discussion surrounding the coronavirus response, to the extent that such a discussion is determined by media gatekeepers and political elites, has been largely driven by narratives and not facts. Facts are messy, incomplete, and don't always present themselves in ways that make patterns easily identifiable. Narratives are malleable, and they don't have to be true to serve their intended purpose. Narratives are also convenient vehicles for affecting elections and wielding political power. As such, a shocking number of articles in recent weeks making deeply negative and pessimistic assertions about the coronavirus response, such as the aforementioned George Packer article, are thinly veiled anti-Trump screeds when they are veiled at all. Perhaps tellingly, very little of that pessimism is reserved for decrying the government's response to the massive economic toll of the pandemic, which tells you something about how culturally insulated the chattering class is. Never mind that the media can't seem to summon anything from their vast reserves of outrage when the response to a crisis might be impeded by Democratic Party politicking, as has been the case multiple times in recent weeks, with Democrats obstructing legislative relief packages. But once you cast aside the press's monomaniacal obsession with the president, you start to see more useful analysis and perspectives on this crisis. For instance, it is absurd to declare that the US is a failed state. However, in many respects, this crisis has exposed our bloated and inefficient government as a failed administrative state. In case you are unfamiliar, administrative state is the political science term used to describe the vast federal bureaucracy that sprung up in the last century or so. Unelected bureaucrats now have unprecedented authority to create and enforce so much regulatory power that many scholars and elected leaders rightly worry that it's a threat to American democracy and constitutional order. And as this crisis shows, because federal agencies have assumed so much responsibility with no democratic accountability, they cannot be depended upon to protect Americans when it matters most. For weeks now, we've seen reporting on critical errors by federal agencies far removed from the White House. But there has been virtually no sustained effort to show how excessive regulation and bureaucratic errors have shown that big government can be deadly. One of the biggest and ongoing government failures in response to the pandemic has been the inability to get large-scale diagnostic testing off the ground. Some of those limitations are technological. We still don't have reliable testing without the need for healthcare professionals to administer the test. But so far, the biggest hindrance has been the federal bureaucracy. Back in late January, Dr. Helen Chu, an infectious disease expert in Seattle, was doing research on the flu and became worried as the first cases of coronavirus started arriving in America. She and her team were already doing research on the flu, and they were in a position to quickly repurpose the tests they were doing to detect the coronavirus. The problem was that she needed federal approval to start testing for the coronavirus and repeatedly got shut down. After weeks of trying and failing to get federal approval to test on her own, on February 25th, Dr. Chu did what any heroic American would have done in her circumstances. She started breaking the law. According to the New York Times, Dr. Chu soon identified a local teenager who had both the virus and no recent travel history, confirming fears that the virus had established itself in the region and had undoubtedly affected countless others. Seattle soon turned into a coronavirus hotspot. Had Dr. Chu quickly been given approval, instead of being forced to wait until her conscience got the better of her, she might have saved lives. And establishing the presence of a coronavirus outbreak in a major urban center weeks earlier might have had national implications in terms of accelerating the local and federal containment strategies. Of course, this was not an isolated incident. The CDC and FDA initially declined to certify tests that were being produced by private companies whose resources and capacity put them in a far better position to get mass testing off the ground than the federal government. Instead, the government followed their own protocols and worked to develop their own test. In an email dated February 26th, obtained by the Wall Street Journal, the Centers for Disease Control was telling state and local officials, quote, testing capacity is more than adequate to meet current testing demands. By mid-March, the results of government testing efforts were obvious. The Wall Street Journal headline on March 19th was, America needed coronavirus tests. The government failed. The specific failures are too detailed and numerous to recount here, but many of the initial tests the CDC produced were faulty and had to be recalled. And all the tests that were done had to inefficiently be sent to CDC headquarters in Atlanta to be tested. And contrary to the CDC's claims that they had adequate testing capacity, the limited number of government-sanctioned tests available meant the CDC implemented very narrow criteria for who could be tested. The only way you could get a test early on was if you had traveled to China or could prove that you had been in contact with someone who had already tested positive for the virus. Even now, we're still learning the extent of the CDC's testing failures. Just this past weekend, the Washington Post reported that CDC testing failures were also the result of a major contamination problem that occurred at CDC facilities, where they were assembling the test kits to send out across the country. According to the Post, the CDC, quote, violated sound manufacturing processes and was responsible for, quote, a glaring scientific breakdown. Which brings us to another issue where the government appears to have botched the response. As the crisis began heating up in March, a dominant story was the lack of ventilators and, quote, personal protective equipment, sometimes known as PPE, for healthcare workers. The media coverage of this was unhelpfully focused on the drama of state governors demanding the federal government conjure these items out of thin air and the Trump administration's reaction to those blunt demands. There was far less reporting on why the federal government didn't have these items stockpiled and ready to distribute in case of an emergency. An op-ed by Professors Charles Silver and David A. Hyman, the co-authors of Overcharged, Why Americans Pay Too Much for Healthcare, gives an eyebrow-raising explanation for our lack of ventilators. In 2006, the Bush administration wisely decided to make preparations for a potential pandemic of exactly this sort. In fact, it appears President Bush himself had read up on the subject of pandemics and to some extent personally directed these efforts, which as of late has led to a strange new respect for a man the media spent most of their presidency trying to undermine. Either way, Bush's personal involvement is worth highlighting because, as we shall see, it's an example of how unelected bureaucracy fails us, even when our elected leadership, which is supposed to be in charge, does the right thing. Anyway, back in the Bush administration, the federal government determined that in case of a national pandemic, the country would need some 70,000 ventilators to be kept in a strategic national stockpile for an event just like the one we're currently experiencing. The Department of Health and Human Services didn't get around to acting on this directive for 4 years. And in 2010, the HHS contracted with a small, relatively unknown manufacturer, Newport Medical Instruments, to build tens of thousands of inexpensive portable ventilators. Before production on the ventilators began, Newport Medical Instruments was bought out by a larger company. The new owners backed out of the contract with the Department of Health and Human Services, and the government finally got around to getting a new contract for the ventilators last year, when it was far too late to do much good. Of course, now federal agencies are finally taking care of the problem. All it took was 14 years and 40,000 dead Americans to get them to act on it. Now, when it comes to PPE, such as N95 masks that healthcare workers need to filter out viruses, our present shortage is a similar tale of incompetence. In this case, the problem is even more inexcusable because the need for masks should have been more obvious and more acute than the need for ventilators. The swine flu outbreak in 2009 resulted in a 2 to 3 year backlog of orders for N95 masks, so the federal government started distributing its own supply of the masks to healthcare workers, eventually distributing about 75% of the strategic national stockpile, the same Bush-era initiative that demanded stockpiling ventilators. But according to Bloomberg News reporting, it appears that after the strategic national stockpile of N95 masks was depleted in 2009, it was never replenished. This is even more unforgivable than the ventilator shortage, as N95 masks are used to address a wide array of public health threats, and there was a pandemic in recent memory where there was heavy demand for them. The failure to have the mask on hand is simply inexcusable. Further, the mask shortage had a potentially deathly side effect for ordinary citizens. After weeks of federal guidance saying American citizens did not need to protect themselves by wearing masks in public, health recommendations changed dramatically. Weeks after other Western countries started encouraging citizens to wear masks in public, federal and local governments started telling Americans to wear masks as well. Masks do seem to be effective at stopping the spread of the coronavirus, but it appears Americans were discouraged from wearing masks, at least in part to stop ordinary citizens from hoarding masks that were otherwise needed by healthcare workers. If federal neglect hadn't resulted in a mask shortage at the outset of the current crisis, perhaps guidance on masks could have been issued weeks earlier, and the outbreak in the US would have been much better contained. Perhaps these shortages seem like an unfortunate anomaly, but anecdotes like this are hardly unique in Washington. On average, the federal procurement process takes anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. There's just no getting around the fact our federal agencies are far too unwieldy to be depended upon in a national crisis. While stringent regulations on healthcare supplies exist for an obvious reason, they also need to be adaptable when lives are on the line. Even in late March, well after the crisis was upon us and hospitals were filling up, there were multiple reports of pallets full of medical supplies sitting in warehouses on docks for a week or more because the FDA still insisted on inspecting all medical supplies, even when they came from trusted and proven suppliers. Just 2 days ago, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan announced that his state had purchased 500,000 coronavirus tests from South Korea. Quote, "I was frosted because my team was saying the FDA approval was going to hold it up," Hogan told the New York Times. I didn't care and I was going to get the tests anyway. According to the New York Times, the FDA only gave its approval for Hogan to use the test as the plane carrying the test was touching down in Maryland this past weekend. It beggars belief that at this late date, the FDA is still holding up tests from reliable sources such as South Korea, a country that has been a leader in efforts to fight the pandemic. Finally, it's worth taking a look at the role the federal government has played in distributing the precious few pharmaceutical treatments we have for viruses such as this. One of the most promising drugs is remdesivir, which was developed 6 years ago in response to similar viral threats such as the West Nile virus, Zika, MERS, and SARS. Gilead, the American pharmaceutical company that developed the drug, never bothered to get the drug approved in the US because the FDA's approval process is far too onerous and expensive given the drug's limited use. Had the drug been available and more widely prescribed these past few years, we might have gained valuable insight into potential treatments for the current pandemic. Instead, we're casting about much more blindly for drug cures right now. Again, if we must insist on comparing the US failures in its pandemic response to other countries, the few countries that have performed better often owe their superior performance to bureaucratic competence. South Korea, for instance, has been widely praised for its ability to get large-scale test and trace programs up and running soon after the coronavirus outbreak. However, this is largely due to the country's proximity to China, which has been the source of an inordinately large amount of historical pandemics. In fact, the original scientific thinking is that even bubonic plague originated not in Europe, but in China sometime around 600 BC. Because South Korea was inordinately impacted by SARS, bird flu, and other recent pandemics from China, the country's experience has led it to dramatically streamline its public health infrastructure and related bureaucracy to address sudden disease outbreaks. Unfortunately for Americans, the ability of our elected leaders to do anything in the way of reforming or reshaping our unelected federal bureaucracy is severely limited. Courts have ruled federal employees have a property right to their jobs. Even President Trump, a man famous for saying "you're fired" and disregarding governmental norms, has hit a brick wall. His administration has spearheaded an admirable initiative to clean house the Department of Veterans Affairs after that agency's widespread incompetence led to the deaths of several veterans unable to get medical treatment in recent years. However, the efforts to rid the agency of bad employees has resulted in a legal morass that has led to reinstating many VA employees that had already been fired, some of them more than once. It is in no way, shape, or form an exaggeration to say that under current laws, the President of the United States has more authority and discretion to start a nuclear war than to fire a significant number of federal workers that are constitutionally under his direct supervision. If you've ever spent time looking at the Office of Personnel Management's databases, and virtually no journalists have done this, you would know that entire cabinet agencies with tens of thousands of employees often go years without terminating a single employee for cause. Of course, as a journalist, I am all in favor of holding the leader of the free world accountable, and I think Trump's leadership certainly hasn't been perfect in this crisis. As another president famously said, "The buck stops here." But we are ignoring vital lessons from this crisis by focusing almost exclusively on narratives that tell the story of failed political leadership at the expense of larger systemic problems in the federal bureaucracy that have undermined America's constitutional order and the good governance that comes with it. To be clear, there are many valiant and competent federal workers giving it their all right now, and they should be lauded for their efforts. I'm sure this crisis will bring about some needed changes and reforms within the bureaucracy, at least on the narrow question of the federal government's ability to respond to certain kinds of pandemics. However, we don't know what the next threat to American safety or national security will be, and odds are good it will be very different than the coronavirus. Once again, we'll be caught flat-footed thanks to a kludgy bureaucracy that lacks the initiative and imagination to anticipate threats that, in retrospect, should have been obvious and preventable. In the meantime, I will say that I would be shocked to learn that if a single federal employee is fired for any number of fatal errors regarding this national emergency. And I don't even need a computer model to make this prediction. It's just a safe bet. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome to the second half of our program. I'm John J. Miller, Director of the Dow Journalism Program here at Hillsdale College on the campus in Michigan. And we've just listened to an excellent presentation by Mark Hemingway at the Kirby Center, Hillsdale College's Kirby Center in Washington, D.C. Mark, thanks so much for joining us and agreeing to take a few questions.
Glad to be here.
Mark, from the start of this coronavirus crisis, we've heard this compared to several major events in American history. It's like Pearl Harbor. It's like 9/11. We've heard it called a 100-year event, which is a reference to the 1918 pandemic. We've also heard it called a black swan. In other words, a kind of major, unpredictable surprise. Is that a useful way of thinking about this conundrum that it's a black swan?
Yeah, I think so. In fact, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the man who invented black swan theory, as it were, or at least popularized it, defines a black swan event as something that is, hugely impactful and totally unforeseen, but at the same time also easily rationalized in retrospect. And this seems to fit the exact definition of that. In that respect, a 100-year event also seems like a good way of describing it as well. Yes, we didn't know when something like this was going to happen, but human history and basic common sense would have told you that we would have been facing a pandemic like this sooner or later.
Did George W. Bush predict it? You referenced this in your remarks, and I gather that in the summer of 2005, in the second term of his presidency, he read a book called The Great Influenza by John Barry and got worried about the problem of a pandemic and developed a passion for ventilators. But did he predict it and maybe put us onto the path of preparedness and then we fell off?
I don't know if he predicted it so much as he was wise enough to realize that this was a prudent thing to prepare for, and that the odds of us encountering something like this were, high enough that the federal government should be ready. And more than that, though, the calculus is such that the amount the federal government would invest in emergency supplies for something like this would be hugely impactful relative to the, cost of stockpiling, say, masks and ventilators and a few other things that are necessary to deal with something like this. So it just seemed like an obvious thing to do. In fact, Tevi Troy, who was a domestic policy advisor in the Bush White House and later an undersecretary at Health and Human Services under President Bush and his administration, wrote a book just a couple of years ago called Shall We Wake the President? That's a history of presidential responses to public health and other crises that have beset this nation in history. And Tevi Troy, in his book just a few years ago, was discussing how the U.S. was unprepared for a potential coronavirus outbreak before this even happened. And I'm sure that Tevi wrote that in part because he was in the Bush administration when these discussions were happening, and prudent and smart people could have seen this coming.
But then bureaucracy got in the way, the failed administrative state, as you called it, and you gave us a good, quick definition of the failed administrative state and the problems that attend to it. But I'm wondering, what is the alternative for us to an administrative state? Don't we want a federal government full of experts who know things about the transmission of disease, having that kind of expertise and then having the power to act upon it? Don't we in fact want a large government with that kind of knowledge and expertise and ability to defend us?
Yes, I think we absolutely do, but I also at the same time think one of the biggest slurs that is constantly, directed at conservatives or people that, advocate, smaller government is that they don't believe in any sort of government. I mean, the truth is that conservatives have always, used the phrase limited government for a reason. There are times, exactly like the one we're in right now, that do in fact call for a strong government response. That needs to be dictated by the needs of the particular crisis, and we need to be flexible about that sort of thing, which is precisely the sort of thing you can't do when everyone is obsessively focused on what the federal government will do, even though constitutionally police powers and other things like that that are useful in crises like this are directed to state and local governments. We just need to be in a situation here where, yes, we have a government that is full of capabilities and expertise, but A, they need to be responsible to political leadership, and there needs to be some accountability for when they mess up. And, this is this is obviously a huge crisis, but there are a million other small crises we've experienced in the last 100 years that we've been dealing with this behemoth, and growing federal executive agencies where, their response has been inadequate, and yet we keep entrusting them with more responsibility, and it becomes harder and harder to make them accountable.
Can a strong governmental response at the federal level, can it also be a deregulatory response? And I'm thinking about an op-ed that was in the Wall Street Journal about a week ago by a couple of scientists at Michigan State University, and they said, we've developed a coronavirus test. It works, but we can't deploy it. People can't use it because the FDA and other regulatory bodies won't let us. So is a deregulatory response, is that an appropriate, strong governmental response?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that that is one thing we need to be looking at, in this crisis, and I gave lots of examples, I hope, of where, existing federal laws got in the way. At a minimum, we need to have some sort of plan for, what laws or regulations that, maybe we need to learn to immediately suspend by some sort of emergency declaration of things like that, so they don't get in the way of a response. But there needs to be a plan to make the federal government nimble in situations like this. And as it stands now, the idea that we're holding up medical supplies that are badly needed while people are dying because they can't get FDA approval, or we're not doing enough testing because we can't get FDA approval again, or we're dependent on the CDC, it's pure insanity, and I think people see that. At the state level, the good news is we have seen some responses that have been very good. A couple of states have suspended licensure requirements for doctors, meaning that if they need more doctors to address the threats in their state, because it's become a hotspot or something like that, they're not going to be exposing doctors to liability if they come in from other states and aren't licensed to practice in that state. So that's a good positive example we're seeing at levels below the federal government, and the federal government, I think, needs to emulate that sort of thing.
How can we judge the success of states in our federal system in confronting coronavirus? Is it just a matter of counting up cases and deaths and population rates and so forth and judging them that way, or have we seen other kinds of strengths and weaknesses?
That's a really difficult question to answer at this point in time. I mean, I think we need more data, and we need to be out on the other side of this to really make some definitive make some definitive conclusions. Obviously, it's going to be a little from column A and a little from column B. I mean, obviously, like I mentioned, there were certain factors about New York City, in terms of it having a population density that is, virtually unrivaled almost anywhere else in the United States, that led to the coronavirus outbreak. At the same time, the local authorities made some decisions regarding public transit and keeping subways open and things like that we've now seen a lot of evidence in retrospect seems like were disastrous decisions. On one hand, New York, a lot of what happened in New York might have been unavoidable, but there are definitely things that we can point to that were wrong. I think in terms of some of the responses and containment strategies, things are a little clearer. Obviously, in Hillsdale's, local state of Michigan, there's been some controversy over some of the things that the governor's done, where people thought that, that they were being a bit draconian, where, liquor stores get to stay open, but, you can't buy seeds to plant in your garden, even though you can buy, plenty of other supplies on the other side of the same Home Depot store where you might get, need essential supplies. So, there are, in terms of the lockdowns and containment policies, I think we're seeing some clearly bad decisions, and we can judge that accordingly.
You mentioned George Packer in your remarks in this piece he wrote for The Atlantic, in which he referred to the United States as a failed state. Do you think in the future, maybe in the weeks and months ahead, he'll say that New York City was a failed state?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. And a good example of why I think it is dangerous to look at a situation like this, particularly without the benefit of hindsight and some sort of historical perspective, strictly from a political lens. Like I said, there are certainly decisions by local authorities in New York that I might be inclined to disagree with because I might have my own inherent political biases. But at the same time, I mean, there were also things that were out of New York's control, and the same is true in virtually every other situation where we're seeing this. There's a little bit of politics involved, and there's a little bit of X factors and biology involved. So it's just absolutely absurd to focus in constantly on this narrative that is entirely dependent on the fact that the occupant of the White House is someone you don't like and belongs to a political party that you've never liked.
Mark, we've talked about the federal response, also the states and cities and all responses at all kinds of levels. What about internationally? And I'm thinking about other governments like China and its actions, and then other international organizations like the World Health Organization. How much should we depend on them? In the future, how much should we rely upon them? Or should we just be prepared to go it alone in problems like this?
Well, this is sort of the $64,000 question I think a lot of experts are trying to deal with right now. There's absolutely no question that the World Health Organization failed us, and specifically failed us because they were susceptible to Chinese propaganda and didn't want to rock the boat in terms of dealing with, the autocratic communist Chinese government. And it is appalling that they were so easily misled in the ways that they were, and there's no question that thousands of lives were lost as a result of the World Health Organization's mistakes. Having said that, again, it's a good idea, and it is very useful to have some sort of international organization that has expertise that can parachute into countries that maybe don't have the public health infrastructure that countries like the United States or Western Europe have, and provide resources to them and stop public health threats in the bud before they spread all over the globe. But if the World Health Organization is going to exist in the future, it's got to be substantially reformed. I mean, a lot of the same problems that I was talking about with America's federal bureaucracy obviously apply to the World Health Organization. It is very much a bureaucracy, and it very much has its own self-interested imperatives, largely because it doesn't really have any accountability. I mean, it's an international organization, multilateral investment. It doesn't have democratic accountability, and for so long has just been sort of left to its own devices and to act on its own selfish interests. So when Donald Trump is talking about withdrawing funding from the World Health Organization, and I would hope that other people would follow suit, at least in terms of, credible threats to the agency, such that the agency responds to the criticisms. And so far, months into this crisis, their response to very valid criticisms for obvious mistakes they made has been, appalling. They just seem to be like doubling down and continuing by, and to a somewhat lesser degree, but nonetheless parroting Chinese propaganda, and it's a big problem.
The media has played an enormously important role throughout this period. Everything from telling us what's happening to explaining what social distancing means to helping think through some of the problems that we're experiencing, how we might have done better. But was the media unprepared for this crisis?
Oh, they're absolutely unprepared for this crisis, and they continue to be unprepared for this crisis. In fact, if you actually followed the news coverage of this from the beginning, I mean, at the time in January, right around the time when this started heating up, and about the time that Trump first issued the federal directive banning travel coming in from China, there were numerous reports in the Washington Post and lots of other mainstream media outlets saying that we didn't need to worry about this, we should be more worried about the flu. There were numerous reports at the time saying that Trump's travel ban, which definitely looks effective in retrospect, was racist and ineffective and other things like that. You had CNN anchors saying on air through early March that this was comparable to the seasonal flu and downplaying the threat. Then, of course, when Trump said some things along those lines, making comparisons to the flu and other things like that in March, the media pounced and pretended that they had all along had this, laser-like focus and, foresight about what this threat was going to turn into. And the reality is, and many of them acted irresponsibly and didn't grasp the nature of the threat themselves. I mean, it's just been kind of a dog's breakfast as far as the media coverage is concerned. And more than that, though, this is a time when we need a strong and credible media, and we just don't have it. Like I said, they have overwhelmingly focused, now that the political consequences of this look like they could be, very bad potentially for the president and the White House. We've just seen, a tremendous amount of doom and gloom and criticism directed at the political leadership without taking stock of, bigger picture failures like systemic bureaucracy and some of the other things I've been talking about that might actually be useful lessons for people. I just think that the news media needs to step back from its sort of, horse race political coverage and examine this with an eye toward what does the average American need to know? What information can we get out there that would actually help stop, the virus? Invest serious effort into determining whether or not the scientific information that they're constantly throwing out is credible or reasonable. I mean, I would think it's, like I said, it's safe to say that a lot of the models we saw early on were very wrong, that were trumpeted by the media. So we just need more sort of, judgment. and that's very much in short supply in the media, unfortunately.
Mark Hemingway, thanks so much for joining us and telling us all about U.S. public health agencies and their failure to prepare for coronavirus.
It was my pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for watching our program.